Hello, I'm Brian Gray. I'm teaching the philosophy of freedom, also called Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, here at the Community Learning Center of Rita Steiner College, and we're housed for this particular session in Los Altos at the Walter School of the Peninsula. We're trying to cover the philosophy of freedom in about 14 hours. We're trying to do all the two prefaces and all 15 chapters in a kind of summary way. So that's what we're attempting to do with this particular presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. Good evening, friends. What we're going to do is we're going to try to work through the book Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. And as you know, this is a translation, an English translation of the book that Rita Steiner wrote in 1893 called The Philosophy of Freedom. And the philosophy of freedom is, Rita Steiner remarked when he was asked near the end of his life what he considered his greatest contribution to humanity. He said, the philosophy of freedom will outlive everything that I've done. So he felt that this is his most significant work. And yet he accomplished so much beyond this book in addition. But you could say this is kind of like the seed out of which everything else that he did has grown. So it's a very significant book. Rita Steiner was born in 1861, and he published the book. He's born in 1861. He publishes the book in 1893, at the end of 1893. Some authors will say 1894. It's right at the end of 1893, beginning of 1894. So how old was Rudolph Steiner when he wrote the book? He was 32. He was in his 33rd year. So it's pretty amazing to feel that by your 33rd year that you really have laid the foundation for something very significant. And yet this is exactly what he did. So the philosophy of freedom, he publishes it in 1893, the philosophy of freedom. The book was written in German, and Rudolph Steiner, when he wrote the book, he was an up-and-coming social figure. He was very well received, and he had been living in Vienna. He moved to Weimar. And he was very well known actually in Europe as a critic, as a social commentator, as an author, as the editor of Goethe's scientific works, and also as the one who really had tremendous influence over his age. He was really recognized by everybody as a rising star. And that continued until about 1902. When, because he began to associate with the Theosophical Society, his reputation plummeted publicly. Yes? And yet he continued to do his work because he had decided to take the bull by the horns. Rather than pussyfoot around about whether or not there is a spiritual world, he decided to just come straight out and begin to work with the Theosophical Society as well. Rita Steiner was always authentic in his insights, and although he has surveyed the whole of philosophy, in fact, he writes a book later on called The Riddles of Philosophy, which is a beautiful history. And you think, oh my goodness, this has got to be terribly dry and terribly dull. Actually, it's one of the most beautifully written books that you'll ever find. And it makes you fall in love with the philosophers and also with the questions that they're wrestling with. So Rudolph Steiner is very familiar, by the age of 32, he's very familiar with other philosophers. He studied the Greeks, he studied the medieval philosophers, he studied all of them really, and continues to grow from them. He's very familiar with the work of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant has had a tremendous impact. Immanuel Kant's particular worldview has had a tremendous impact, and Fichte and Schelling and Hegel also have kind of been taken up with the worldview of Immanuel Kant. And so Rudolph Steiner is coming in now, fresh at the beginning of, well, he's coming in actually at the end of the 19th century, 1894. He's 32 years of age. What he decides to do, though, is he decides that he's really been wrestling. The author of this book, who is Christoph Lindenberg, Rudolph Steiner biography, this has just recently come out in the last year in English. It's been published in German for a number of years, but it's really quite a beautiful study. And there's a whole chapter on the setting of the philosophy of freedom, 25 pages long, to tell you what Rita Steiner was thinking beforehand, the struggles he was having, the social context he was having. It's really a very fine study. But Lindenberg quotes the fact that Rudolph Steiner was wrestling with the question of freedom from about age 20 till about age 33. Yeah, the question. So he'd already been beginning in his writings. Already the question of freedom begins to arise as a major question when he's 20 years old. So he's already beginning. So he's wrestling with this question. He doesn't just one day decide to write a book and turn it out. In fact, many of the passages, according to Lindenberg, many of the passages of the philosophy of freedom are actually written many years earlier. And it's almost like he's kind of assembling, stitching together his various thoughts over this long period of time between ages 20 and 33. He's stitching together his thoughts and trying to fabricate or trying to weave a sensible philosophy of freedom. If we just look at the structure of the book itself, you all have been reading the book, you've all been working with the book. This particular version, called The Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, the book is divided into two parts. The first is called Theory, Part 1. Theory, the knowledge of freedom. Yeah. And Part 2 is called Practice, the reality of freedom. And then there is a chapter called Final Questions, the consequences of monism. So Rudolph Steiner, actually, he leads us through these two different parts of the book. And the first 7 chapters of the book, which comes under the knowledge of freedom, he's really asking some very fundamental questions. How do we know what we know? Yeah. If you state something and assert something and you say, I'm absolutely certain that this is so, how have you come to that conclusion? And can you really stand for it? So one of the basic questions really is, before any science can arise, is how do we know? But he didn't start there. He actually started with the second half of the book in terms of his thinking. The question is it possible for a human being to be free? Is human freedom possible? And so he realized that in asking that question, he had to solve the first question. You won't be able to give a definitive answer about whether a human being can be free or not unless you have made the clear structure in your thinking. How do we come to certainty about anything? How could we decide whether a person was free or not free if thinking didn't bring us to knowledge, if we couldn't be certain about anything? So in looking at the book, I just would like to pose a kind of setting. In a certain way, we could say, coming out of in the 19th century, of course, through the Industrial Revolution and through the Counter-Reformation and through all the various stages of human evolution, up into in the medieval period of time, many people were really swayed by faith. There was a tremendous belief in the divine world, and there was still a living feeling, at least in some cultures, a living feeling for the divine. But it was tapering off because, as we understand, as Rita Steiner later presents to us, the consciousness of the human being is evolving, and whereas we all were in past incarnations very, very clairvoyant, gradually in succeeding incarnations we became less clairvoyant, and we began more and more to involve ourselves with the sense world. And the crisis has arisen, particularly in the 19th century. Is the human being merely the product of heredity and environment? Or is the human being an individual, and what role does individuality play? And is there a divine world or not? Now, if we, there's two different premises. We could say, on the one hand, suppose there is a divine world. Yeah? If there's a divine world, we could say then the question of freedom could initially say, well, if the human being is subject to the laws of the divine world, then the task of the human being would be to find out what the divine world has in mind for the human being and to obey. Yeah. And so in a certain sense, if the task of the human being is to break through to perception, we were once connected to this divine world, we still feel a longing for it, but if the divine world actually has a plan for the human being, then the job of the human being would be to find out what that plan is and try to abide by it, yeah, to do the right thing. But of course, the threat there is that the human being, if there is a plan for every human being, then the human being is only being obedient when they discover the plan, and therefore, whether they do or don't is really just a question of how accurately they're able to perceive the reality of their situation. But freedom would be an illusion if we are merely subject to the laws of the spiritual world. If a divine spiritual world is dictating to us what we must do, then certainly freedom is an illusion. Our task is to figure out what that is and either break it or do it, but either way we're not free. So if the divine spiritual world dictates to us, freedom is an illusion. On the other hand, there's been a tremendous study of nature, and if the kingdoms of nature, if the human being is merely a natural being, if we have merely evolved through evolution, but there is no spiritual world, if we're merely a product of nature, then we have the same question. We know that nature is subject to certain laws. We study the laws of nature. How could the human being imagine that they could escape the laws of nature and do something other than what nature has planted into them? So if we are merely the product of nature, and then we're subject to what nature dictates to us, that means that we are completely the victim of our passions and our desires and our instincts and our bodily needs. And so the task to live a happy life in relationship to nature is to find out what the laws of nature are and to live accordingly, or to live instinctively. But in the same way, if nature is dictating to the human being, freedom is an illusion. So we have these two threats in a certain sense. If there is a God, and God is telling us what to do, we're certainly not free. But if there is no God, and but certainly there is nature, because we can sense nature, if nature is dictating to us what we must do, then we're not free either. So do we begin to see that the question of freedom is a kind of a ticklish question, because depending on our belief system, if we are merely natural beings, or if we are spiritual beings living in the kingdoms of nature, where does freedom play in anyway? So these were the questions that Rita Steiner was wrestling with. What is the nature of the human being?